A Boeing 737 is cruising at 34,000 feet over the Greek countryside. Air traffic control tries to make contact. Nothing. They try again. Silence. Greek fighter jets scramble to intercept what they think might be a hijacking. The F-16s pull alongside the passenger jet and peer into the cockpit windows. What they see makes no sense. The captain's seat is empty. The first officer is slumped over the controls, unconscious. They can see oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling. The passengers are motionless in their seats. The fighter pilots watch helplessly as the Boeing continues flying on autopilot. A ghost ship in the sky with 121 people aboard. No one is flying the plane. And in a few minutes, it's going to run out of fuel. This is the story of Helios Airways Flight 522, and how a single switch in the wrong position killed everyone on board. Keep watching and find out how something so simple became so catastrophically deadly. August 14, 2005. Larnaca, Cyprus. It's a typical Mediterranean morning, hot and bright, and Helios Airways Flight 522 is preparing for what should be a routine 2-hour hop to Athens. Then on to Prague. Helios is a scrappy little airline, only 3 years old, the kind of budget carrier that's trying to make it work in the intensely competitive world of European aviation. They're flying on razor-thin margins. Every delay costs money. Every maintenance issue is a headache. But they're making it work. Barely. The aircraft is a Boeing 737-300, registration 5BDBY, an older bird that's been around since 1998. Nothing fancy, but Boeing 737s are the workhorses of the aviation industry. It's been checked multiple times. The mechanics think they've got it sorted. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten is a 58-year-old German pilot with thousands of flight hours. Experienced, professional, by the book. His first officer is Pampos Charalambis, a 51-year-old Cypriot pilot who knows the route well. They've got the experience you'd want in a cockpit. Also on board is Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant who happens to hold a commercial pilot license. He's not rated on the 737, but he knows his way around an aircraft. This detail will matter later. At 6:07 a.m. local time, Flight 522 is cleared for takeoff. The engines spool up. The plane accelerates down the runway and lifts off into the morning sky. Everything is normal for about 2 minutes. Then things start going wrong. Quietly at first. Insidiously. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself with alarms and flashing lights. Well, actually, there are alarms and flashing lights. But here's where the story gets weird. The crew doesn't react the way you'd expect. Just 5 minutes into the flight, air traffic control in Nicosia notices something odd. Flight 522 isn't responding to calls. They try again. Nothing. The plane is still climbing, still on course, but the pilots aren't talking. It's like the radio suddenly stopped working, except the radio is fine. The pilots just aren't using it. Inside the cockpit, warning systems are going absolutely berserk. The cabin altitude warning horn is blaring, a continuous ear-splitting sound that means the cabin is losing pressurization. The equipment cooling warning light is on. The passenger oxygen masks have deployed automatically. Everything is screaming at the pilots that something is catastrophically wrong. And the pilots do respond. Sort of. Captain Merten and First Officer Charalambis are troubleshooting. They're going through checklists. They're looking at the door seal warning that's been plaguing this aircraft. They think that's the problem. A door seal. They're focused on it, running through procedures, trying to figure out which door isn't sealed properly. They're working the problem. But they're working the wrong problem. And here's why. The night before this flight, mechanics had performed a pressurization leak check on the aircraft. This is routine maintenance. To do this test, you have to switch the pressurization system from automatic to manual mode. Makes sense, right? You need manual control to run the test. The mechanics did their test. Everything checked out fine. The plane was good to go. But someone forgot to switch the pressurization system back to automatic. One switch, one small rotary switch in the overhead panel, stuck in the manual position when it needed to be in auto. That's it. That's the entire disaster right there in that one switch position. In manual mode, the pressurization system doesn't automatically maintain cabin pressure as the aircraft climbs. It just sits there doing nothing. waiting for someone to manually control it. And as Flight 522 climbed toward its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, the cabin pressure started dropping. The passenger oxygen masks automatically deployed. At 14,000 feet, you start getting impaired. Your thinking gets fuzzy. You don't realize you're in trouble. It's like being drunk. But you don't know you're drunk. The pilots were confused. The warnings didn't make sense to them. The door seal warning they'd been briefed about seemed like the obvious culprit. They were hypoxic, operating on rapidly diminishing oxygen to their brains, and they were fixated on the wrong problem. And hypoxia is insidious because it sneaks up on you. You don't realize you're dying. You just get more and more confused, more sluggish, until you pass out. By 6:30 a.m., both pilots were unconscious. The autopilot was still flying the plane beautifully, maintaining heading and altitude, doing exactly what it was programmed to do. But the humans were gone. Flight 522 had become a ghost flight. At 6:41 a.m., Greek air traffic control noticed the aircraft was entering their airspace without clearance and wasn't responding to radio calls. They immediately suspected a hijacking. This is only 4 years after September 11th. A non-responsive aircraft over a major city is everyone's nightmare scenario. The Greek Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept. The F-16s caught up with the Boeing 737 at 7 a.m. The fighter pilots positioned themselves alongside the passenger jet, close enough to look directly into the cockpit. What they saw was surreal and terrifying. The captain's seat was empty. The first officer was slumped forward, motionless. They could see oxygen masks hanging from the ceiling and passengers who appeared to be unconscious or dead. The fighter pilots reported what they saw. Greek authorities didn't know what to do. They had a passenger jet flying on autopilot with no one at the controls and 121 people aboard who might already be dead. They couldn't shoot it down over Athens. The potential for casualties on the ground was too high. All they could do was escort it and wait. But someone on board was still alive. Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant with a commercial pilot license, had grabbed a portable oxygen bottle from the cabin, while everyone else slowly succumbed to hypoxia, including the passengers in the cabin whose emergency oxygen masks only provided about 12 to 15 minutes of air, enough to get you down to a safe altitude but not enough for a 2-hour flight at 34,000 feet. Prodromou stayed conscious. At 7:55 a.m., nearly 2 hours into the flight, the F-16 pilots saw something that gave them hope. A figure appeared in the cockpit. Someone was moving. Andreas Prodromou had made his way forward and was now in the captain's seat. He was alive. He was conscious. And he was desperately trying to save the aircraft. The fighter pilots tried to communicate with him using hand signals. They wanted him to follow them to a safe landing spot. Prodromou waved back. He saw them. But he was in an impossible situation. He wasn't rated on the 737. He didn't know the aircraft systems. The captain and first officer were dead or unconscious. The aircraft had been flying on autopilot for almost 2 hours and was now running low on fuel. Prodromou tried. You have to give him that. He tried everything he could think of. He attempted to make radio contact. He was seen waving at the fighter jets, acknowledging their presence. He was moving around the cockpit, clearly trying to figure out the controls. But the 737 is a complex machine, even for a trained commercial pilot. Jumping into an unfamiliar aircraft type in an emergency situation with no briefing, no checklist, and limited oxygen is nearly impossible. The left engine flamed out. Fuel starvation. The aircraft had been flying for almost 2 hours, and the tanks were running dry. The autopilot tried to compensate, adjusting the trim to account for the asymmetric thrust. 6 minutes later, at 8:11 a.m., the right engine quit. A very heavy, very aerodynamically poor glider at 34,000 feet. The autopilot disconnected automatically when both engines failed, and the aircraft began descending. The F-16 pilots watched helplessly as the Boeing 737 entered a steep spiral dive. Andreas Prodromou had seconds to do something, anything, to save the aircraft. But without engine power, without hydraulics, without electrical systems, the 737 is nearly impossible to control. The aircraft spiraled down, gaining speed, and at 8:13 a.m., it impacted a hillside near the village of Grammatico, about 25 miles north of Athens. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, scattering wreckage across the rocky terrain. All 121 people on board were killed instantly. 48 were Greek nationals heading home. The rest were Cypriot tourists, looking forward to connecting flights to European destinations. Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant who fought so hard to save everyone, died with them. The investigation that followed was thorough and disturbing. The Hellenic Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board pulled together the pieces, literally and figuratively, to understand what happened. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder painted a clear, horrible picture. The pressurization mode selector switch was found in the manual position. That one switch. That one simple mechanical switch that someone forgot to return to auto after a routine maintenance check. The investigation found that the mechanics who performed the pressurization test the night before had failed to return the switch to automatic mode. The mechanics later stated they believed the flight crew would notice and correct the switch position during pre-flight checks. The flight crew's pre-flight checks apparently didn't catch it. But the investigation went deeper because this wasn't just about one switch. This was about a series of failures, each one building on the last, creating what accident investigators call the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. You've got multiple layers of defense, each one with holes. Usually the holes don't line up, but when they do, disaster slips right through. The first hole was the maintenance error. The switch wasn't returned to auto. That's hole number one. The second hole was the flight crew's failure to catch it during pre-flight checks. Hole number two. The third hole was the crew's misinterpretation of the warnings. They thought they had a door seal problem when they actually had a pressurization problem. Hole number three. But here's where it gets really damning. The investigation found that Boeing's warning systems had a design flaw that contributed to the confusion. The cabin altitude warning horn sounds identical to the takeoff configuration warning horn. Same sound, different meanings. One means you're about to crash on takeoff because something isn't set correctly. The other means your cabin is depressurizing, and everyone is about to die. Same horn. The pilots heard the horn during climb-out. Their training told them that horn on the ground or during takeoff means configuration warning. But they were already in the air, climbing. The configuration warning wouldn't be active. They should have immediately recognized it as the cabin altitude warning. But the cognitive load, the stress, the emerging hypoxia, it all worked against them. They fixated on the door seal issue that had been a recurring problem with this aircraft. The investigation also found that Helios Airways had a corporate culture problem. The airline was cutting corners to save money. Maintenance was deferred when possible. Training wasn't as thorough as it should have been. There was pressure to keep flights on schedule. The company had even received warnings from Cyprus aviation authorities about safety issues. Those warnings were largely ignored. The families of the victims sued everyone involved. Boeing, Helios Airways, the maintenance company, the Greek government. The trials took years. In the end, the airline's management was found criminally negligent. Helios Airways never recovered from the disaster. The airline ceased operations in 2006, just 1 year after the crash. And the company's management faced manslaughter charges in Cyprus. But the real lesson here isn't about blame. It's about how modern aviation accidents happen. We like to think there's always one big obvious thing that goes wrong. A mechanical failure. A pilot error. Something clear and definable. But that's not how it works anymore. Modern aircraft are so safe, so redundant, so well designed that it takes multiple failures happening simultaneously to bring one down. Flight 522 needed the maintenance crew to forget the switch. It needed the flight crew to miss it during checks. It needed the warning systems to be ambiguous enough that a hypoxic crew could misinterpret them. It needed the emergency oxygen system to not provide enough time for passengers to survive until landing. It needed all of these holes to line up perfectly. And they did. The aviation industry learned from Flight 522. Boeing changed the warning horn system on 737s to make the cabin altitude warning distinct and unmistakable. Airlines revised their maintenance procedures to include multiple verification steps for critical switch positions. Training programs now emphasize recognizing and responding to hypoxia. The pressurization system controls were redesigned to be more intuitive and to provide clearer feedback to pilots. These changes mattered. Since 2005, There hasn't been another commercial aviation accident quite like Flight 522. The ghost flight phenomenon, where an aircraft flies on after the crew becomes incapacitated, is now something pilots train for specifically. It's called a RECO event, rapid incapacitation of crew, and modern procedures are designed to catch it before it becomes catastrophic. Andreas Prodromou became a tragic hero in Greece and Cyprus. Memorials were erected. His family received recognition for his desperate attempt to save everyone on board. He stayed conscious longer than anyone else. He made it to the cockpit. He tried. In the end, he didn't have the tools, the training, or the time to succeed. But he tried, and that counted for something. The crash of Helios Airways Flight 522 stands as a reminder that in aviation, the little things matter. A switch in the wrong position, a checklist item missed, a warning misinterpreted. Each one seems minor. Each one, individually, wouldn't cause a disaster. Add some bad luck and human factors and you get 121 people dead on a Greek hillside because no one was flying the plane. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive into aviation accidents interesting, there are more stories like this worth exploring, each one teaching us something about how complex systems fail and how we learn to make them safer. The crash of Helios Flight 522 was preventable, which somehow makes it worse. But the lessons learned from that terrible day have made flying safer for everyone. Sometimes that's the only consolation we get.